Echoes of Us, a novel by HopeHappy. Chapter 2. The Drive She Didn't Expect to Take. Celia. The letter had arrived on a Friday. Celia Duarte read it once at her kitchen counter, still in her coat from the office, standing. Then she read it again sitting down, which was not something she did with legal documents as a rule. Sitting implied the document had surprised her, and she had trained herself out of being surprised by documents, the same way she had trained herself out of most things that required her to admit she hadn't seen something coming. She read it a third time at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her laptop open beside it, and by the end of the third reading, she had already begun the search. Lenora Margaret Wycliffe, deceased, September 14th of this year. Property known as The Mooring, Brackenport, Massachusetts. 30 days. Cohabitation required. Both beneficiaries present under the same roof, or the inheritance did not vest. These were Ms. Wycliffe's explicit wishes, stated before two witnesses, non-negotiable in the language of the document, and in the evident disposition of the woman who had drafted it. The other beneficiary's name was Adrian Harrow. Celia typed it into the search bar with the even keystrokes of someone doing a routine thing. She looked up everyone she was going to be in a room with, professionally speaking, and 30 days under the same roof in a contested estate qualified as professional if she chose to frame it that way. Which she did. The results were immediate. Adrian Harrow, 32, essayist, New York. He wrote for the journals that serious people read with the mixture of admiration and surveillance that constituted literary attention. Long, deliberate pieces about consciousness and culture and the ethics of solitude. His author photograph showed a man with dark eyes and the expression of someone attending to something the camera couldn't register. She read the titles of his essays. The Glass Partition, What We Keep When We Stop Watching, Against the Examined Life, a Reconsideration. She had expected a lawyer, someone with standing, a counter-argument, a billable rate. Instead, she had someone who made his living describing the interior of his own experience, and had been left half a Victorian property by a woman he presumably hadn't seen in years. She considered this. She closed the laptop. She made a list. This was not a pathology. It was a method. She had made lists since she was 19. Since the week after her father died, and the only means she'd found to move through a world that had rearranged itself without notice was to write down the next concrete thing and do it. Law school applications, study schedules, procedural notes. The lists were not anxiety. They were the opposite of anxiety, evidence that the next thing existed and was within reach. The list she made on Friday night was brief. Research the estate, confirm the probate terms, pack for coastal weather, leave Tuesday, inform the firm. She did not write, inform the firm. She noticed this. She moved on. She left Boston at 6 on a Tuesday morning and drove in the particular quiet of early departures when the city was still in the process of becoming itself, and the roads belonged briefly to the people who had somewhere specific to be. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. She was comfortable in silence in a way she understood was a professional asset, and declined to examine beyond that. She thought about the estate. Lenora Wycliffe had died at 81, leaving a Victorian coastal property to two people who had, as far as Celia could determine, no recent relationship with her and no expectation of being named. She had searched every accessible record. What she found? Property documents, a handful of local newspaper mentions from the 1970s and 1980s, a Wycliffe who attended town meetings, donated to the library fund, appeared without fanfare, and one notable absence. Lenora Wycliffe appeared in no professional record after 1968. Before 1968, the Massachusetts Bar Association membership rolls, 1961 to 1968. 7 years, and then nothing. Not retirement, not relocation, not a change of practice area. Simply gone from every professional register, the way people went when they chose to disappear rather than transition. On her legal pad, under the category Questions, she had written, 7 years. Why stop? Why Brackenport? Beneath that, in slightly smaller handwriting, Marta. 1951, same year. She had found it in the Brackenport Property Index, a digitized archive through the County Historical Society, accessible after the firm databases returned nothing useful. Lenora Wycliffe as primary resident of the coastal property from 1948. And in the 1951 lodger registration, Marta Duarte listed at the same address for approximately 8 months. Marta Duarte. Her grandmother, who had arrived from Lisbon in 1947 and settled somewhere on the New England coast, and whose life before Celia's father was a collection of received impressions rather than known facts. Marta had been a seamstress. Marta had been, in Nolan Duarte's telling, the strongest woman who ever lived because she never needed anyone to tell her she existed. He had said this with the certainty of a son who had absorbed his mother's survival as identity, and Celia had received it the same way, and neither of them had paused to ask what it had cost. 2 women in the same house, in the same year, in a small coastal town. Celia had noted it because she noted things. She had filed it under coincidence, pending, and kept searching. The filing was clean. The pending was doing more work than she'd authorized, and she was aware of this, and she drove on. The coast road arrived the way the coast always arrived, without preparation and without apology. One moment she was in the corridor of pitch pine and scrub oak, the light low and salt white, and the next the road crested a hill and the Atlantic was simply there, gray-green and enormous, entirely indifferent to being looked at. She drove through Brackenport without stopping and followed the road north along the promontory. The houses grew older and further apart. The wind was audible through the car windows, a low, continuous sound with enough presence to qualify as weather rather than background. The road ended at an iron gate set into a stone wall. She pulled onto the road's shoulder and cut the engine, and sat for a moment. Beyond the gate, a gravel driveway curved through wind-bent spruce toward the house. The assessor's photograph from the estate documents had shown a gray Victorian mass against a gray sky. The photograph had not adequately prepared her. The mooring was large in the unself-conscious way of old houses that had grown into their geography. The cedar siding salt-bleached to silver, the stone foundation part of the promontory itself, the whole structure occupying its place on the cliff with the subtle authority of something that had decided a long time ago that it was staying. Its windows were dark, not vacant dark, attentive dark, the particular quality of windows that were waiting rather than empty. She got out of the car. The wind came off the Atlantic immediately, cold and direct, with the mineral clarity of October coast air after the summer's warmth had burned entirely off. She stood at the gate with her hand on the latch and the brass keys in her coat pocket, and looked at the house for a moment. The keys had arrived from the attorney's office on Monday, courier delivered, in a padded envelope with a wax seal that she had noted at the time as theatrical. Standing at the gate in the wind, with the house on its promontory before her and the Atlantic audible below the cliffs, she revised this assessment. The seal had been applied carefully because the envelope contained something worth sealing, not theater, accuracy. She opened the gate and walked a few steps up the gravel drive. Then she stopped. The attorney's letter had specified both beneficiaries. The terms were specific and non-negotiable and had been designed, as far as Celia could determine, by a woman who chose her language carefully and meant what she wrote. She was not going to walk up that driveway alone and stand at the front door of a house she was legally required to share, as though the sharing were a formality rather than the point. She went back to the gate. She checked the time. She had been at the gate for 6 minutes. She leaned against the stone wall and watched the water, and waited, which was not something she was practiced at, and which she managed by watching the water. The cliffs below the promontory were dark granite, salt-marked, holding their ground against the Atlantic with the composure of something that had been holding it for longer than anyone's argument about ownership had existed. She had not told anyone at the firm where she was going. Not her assistant, not her managing partner, not the colleague she occasionally had dinner with and called a friend in the qualified way of people who spent most of their time at work. She had filed a leave request, 5 days, personal, and left on Tuesday morning without elaboration, which was not unprecedented. Celia did not elaborate as a rule. Elaboration invited questions, and questions led to the kind of negotiation she had not wanted to have about this particular trip. But standing at the gate, she gave herself the more accurate version. She had not told anyone because she had not wanted anyone to be able to find her, not to follow her, not to call her back with a motion deadline or a partner's question, or the careful, attentive watchfulness that trailed junior partners even on their days off. She had wanted to arrive at a place that did not yet have a file on her, that did not know her hourly rate, or her win record, or the specific form of her professional composure, which was considerable and which was, at its foundation, a structure she had been building since she was 19 years old. She had wanted, without having examined the want until this moment, to arrive somewhere before she figured out who she was supposed to be there. She heard the engine before the headlights. A car on the road below, moving with the careful pace of someone navigating unfamiliar ground in fading light. Then the headlights crested the hill, not aggressive, not hurried, with the quality of a vehicle that had been driving a long time and had been thinking about its destination for most of the journey. She stood at the gate of the mooring with the brass keys in her hand and the Atlantic behind her, making its perpetual case against the cliff, and watched the headlights begin their descent. She had read the opening paragraph of The Glass Partition on Friday night. It began with a man in a library and ended with the sentence, "The opposite of loneliness is not company. It is the experience of being accurately perceived." She had filed it under sentimental and closed the tab. She had decided he would be manageable. Watching the headlights come down the hill through the last of the October light, she was aware that manageable had been the wrong frame. Not necessarily wrong about him, but wrong as a category for this. You could not assess a situation as manageable before you had stood in it, before you knew what it required of you, before the house at the top of the driveway had a chance to weigh in, which, she understood now, was precisely what Lenora Wycliffe had been counting on. The headlights closed the distance. The word that arrived had no logical basis, which placed it outside any category she kept. It was reckoning. She didn't know yet whose.